Welcome to our mutual interest. I'm your host, Mina Fombo, but it's your stories that make this show more than a Heising podcast. Spades in the grind, let's go. On today's episode, I'm joined by Lewis Gray, a culture, inclusion, anti-racist practice and leadership consultant whose work is grounded in one big question. How do we create environments where people grow, belong and perform at their best? Lewis is also the only man I know who went from dreaming of a top 10 music hit to over 10 years decoding human behaviour and building a practice that blends psychology, behaviour change and lived experience into what he calls the practical stuff. We also talk identity and belonging, childhood shaping adulthood, navigating Wales as a mixed heritage kid, the resilience you don't choose but somehow inherit, and the legendary cheat code Lewis discovered for turning lived experience into organisational change. Lewis, so glad to have you join us on the podcast. Thank you for coming in.
Thank you for having me. I'm really excited.
Let's get straight into it because, as ever with all of my guests, there's always so much to talk about. People that have listened to the cast know that I'm a filmmaker as well, a bit of a storyteller, and I love a backstory to people. So I want you to bring our listener into who you are. How do you go from being this young lad in Wales, living your best life, to becoming a culture, inclusion and leadership consultant? Because I just don't believe any 6-year-old says I want to be an inclusion consultant. And maybe there's some out there that do, but I don't believe it's true. So first of all, did you wake up when you were young and be like, I want to be an inclusion consultant? Just to land my point first.
No, I definitely didn't even know those words existed. I think 6-year-old me didn't even know that they needed to exist. But yeah, I can definitely share where my journey came from and get to that moment when I thought, actually, this is me. This is what I'm destined to do, if there is such thing as destiny.
So tell us, first of all, who are you? And how did you get here? I
started off on a bit of a wiggly career path, I guess, to this point. Finished university doing a music degree. I was always thought, I'm going to go into the creative industries. I'm going to be successful in that setting. And I kind of had the mindset of, I'm going to finish uni and just have, a top 10 record. And I didn't really plan anything else beyond that. So yeah, that was kind of how I planned it. I finished uni. It was what's next? What's this big moment? And I really didn't have a plan other than this top 10 record that didn't exist. And my dad said to me, why don't you go and have a summer away? So yeah, I went off. I had a summer living in Ibiza. It was great. I got to really grow up and sort of be outside of Wales for a long period of time for the first time ever. So, being Welsh and only ever living in Wales and experiencing Wales, it was the first time being out of the country and seeing the world through a different lens for the first time. Coming back, having that experience of being overseas, then finding out what is it I want to do next, still thinking about this top 10 record, which was just this constant thing that I needed. And then figuring out, well, actually, if I want to carry on in the music industry, I'm not getting a role yet. Let me go back to education. So I went back to education, did my master's. I think during my master's is when I realized, actually, this top 10 record dream isn't going to happen. And I needed to think about what my plan B was. Halfway through my master's, there was an opportunity to go and be a hourly paid lecturer. So I thought, actually, let me use my experience from being overseas in Spain, where I was doing a lot of events, and I'm doing music, and see if I can be an events business, a music lecturer of some variety.
I'm loving this pivot already from the top 10 record to this lecturer, but keep going.
The top 10 record, deep down, that's still there. I still look at that and go, maybe in the next 10 years, but there's a time and a place for that. So yeah, going into becoming a lecturer was really interesting. Made a CV, emailed the hiring manager. That was it. It was just kind of, okay, you're in. I didn't even have to do a big interview for it, which was I didn't know that wasn't a thing at the time. So I was like, okay, this is just how they work. I remember going to that first day. The hiring manager obviously didn't know what I looked like, didn't know anything about me, just seen me as a piece of paper, I guess. And he just walked straight past me. I think he thought I was a student. I think I was, how old would I be? 23, 24. So really early career academic. But yeah, it was a fantastic experience to understand, actually, I quite like this environment. I never thought about becoming a teacher or being in education, but it was my first exposure to it. And I absolutely loved it. I guess it played into the performance side of music. You're almost performing and teaching and being a center of attention at times, I guess.
And you have a ready-made audience because you're at the front and the students are there.
Yeah. And do you know what? It takes me back to one time, not at that institution, but another institution that I worked at. I remember just playing with my performances and sort of figuring out who am I as an academic. I looked around quite quickly and realized not a lot of academics looked like me, or even as like through an age lens, they weren't as young as me in many cases, being sort of 23, 24. I was like, well, how do I not be like them, but bring my own identity to my teaching? And I remember seeing Lewis Hamilton at Formula One riding through the paddock on a scooter, like a little micro scooter, and I was thinking, I'm going to try this. So I went to Halfords and I bought a micro scooter, and I took a micro scooter to the campus, and I was sort of scooting around the corridors, scooting across to the lecture theatre, and just like really getting into it, getting told off by security as well for having a scooter in the building. But do you know what? It resonated with the students, like just scooting into a lecture theatre, just leaving my scooter at the front and then delivering a session. I bumped into a student many years later, and they're like, I just remember you. And she had the video on like her Snapchat story of me scooting into the lecture theatre. And it just made me think, like, actually, I was finding who I was and who I wanted to be.
So many people listen to some of our other episodes, but I was talking to Uella Jackson, and we were talking about play and how do we find play and creativity into our professions. And a lot of the time, if you're working in something like housing or in academia or, in inclusion work, whatever that might look like, it's very serious topics. But it's like, if we release our sort of inner child and we can find play and creativity through the work that we do, what does that release in us? And I think when you're sometimes the first to do something, there's no rules. So like you said, you're young, do you know what I mean? You're mixed heritage, you're in this space, people don't look like you, people aren't like you. It's almost like you can create the rules. And why not come in on a scooter?
Yeah, and I like that. Particularly in my early career, I definitely played into the being able to get away with a bit of naivety, in terms of being able to go, oh, I didn't know you're supposed to do it that way. Let me just try this way and see what you can really play with in the sector. And do you know what? I think it made me a better educator in that sense, but not realizing it at the time. Being able to really understand what it means to have, I guess, that play. Because that play, looking back, was the connection piece.
It's the engagement, isn't it, right?
Yeah. And, it went beyond that. It was about like, okay, I was like, right, we'll play songs on the way into the lecture. And I was like, curate playlists around like what songs are going to set the mood. And I remember having one lecture where, at a different institution, where we were just having a conversation about, because I played different songs coming in, and it went into sort of wrestling introductions from like what you'd see on the TV. And then the students were like, well, can we walk into music? And I was like, cool, you pick a song. And then students wanted to come into these different songs. So it was building that up and then having that relationship. And I was privileged enough then, particularly in that institution, when I realized what play worked and what play didn't work and what buttons you could really interact with students. I ended up winning a couple of awards then within the institution I was in through, it was like best course leader, best student experience. And these things at the time, I just thought, okay, that's what I do. And then it was only when I looked around the following year and I was nominated and shortlisted and won again, did I realize, oh, actually, I'm doing something that's really impactful for my students. And whatever they're writing about me afterwards is resonating with, at the time, it was the student union who were giving out these awards. It was resonating with them as well. And I feel like that really cemented what I wanted to do in higher education.
I just really love that. And I think the key thing for me is about the impact. I think sometimes we're just, like you said, we're just being our authentic selves. We're trying to like improve our practice or improve how we're sharing practice or whatever it is. And you're just doing it because you think it's going to work or it's good or it's the way you work. But then to get sort of that type of feedback without necessarily asking for it, and then it continue, and the students themselves have, demonstrated the impact that's having, that's great, because you can't learn from someone you don't respect, or it's harder to learn from someone when you are challenged maybe negatively. Do you know what I mean? And it's harder to learn in an environment that you don't feel comfortable in or that you don't belong in. And I think what you've done is you've created connections, sense of belonging. You've shown it's okay to be who you are. You've kind of responded to their requests around the WWE or WWF sort of way of doing things. And it sounds great. Like, it's like you'd be looking forward to go to that lecture.
There's 2 points there that I think are important that I've kind of like glossed over, like the great parts. I almost like the highlight reel of that. But what that came with being different in that sense of how I was going to interact with students, being someone that looks like me in terms of being mixed heritage, it came with a lot of battles in there to get to those highlights. But then it was a struggle because, and this might link back to what you mentioned at the beginning, when did you realize that doing inclusion work was the kind of the thing and what I wanted to do? And it was when I was in higher education having some of these battles. After I finished doing my hourly paid lectureship, I realized I wanted to do this full time. How do I do this full time? I started applying for roles and I just couldn't get shortlisted. I'd never applied for roles like this at this level. I read an article, and I couldn't tell you where it was, but I read something around whitening resumes. I didn't know what this was, but I read it and I was like, okay, so if in my CV I could portray things that didn't necessarily link to where I was from, or my name may sound a bit posher, or other aspects of my life might seem a little bit more rosier, without massively nudging it away from the truth. So I created myself, but rather than being Lewis Gray, I just used my middle names, which isn't particularly posh, but they sounded, in my eyes at the time, better. So my middle name is John Charles. So I used Charles Grayson as my name. I thought that might sound less like Lewis Gray, but actually I could get away with it. And I remember my grandmother saying to me at the time, she was like, what are you going to do when you turn up and you're not white? I was like, we'll cross that bridge. And I remember jokingly saying, I'll just say I've been on holiday. And I just was like, so this was like the naivety of me at the time, just being like, we'll wing it when we get there. So I did this. And I ended up putting 2 applications into organizations. I put my actual one and the one that I whitened. All the experiences were the same. So I was trying to A/B it. My whitened resume got shortlisted nearly 3 times more than my actual myself. It was like really eye-opening. And I actually wrote a piece for the Times Higher Education anonymously at the time, because I was like, if I put my name to this might backfire in the future. And I wrote it anonymously. I talked about my experience and I said, this is what was happening. And I realized, I guess why I did that was because I was never getting shortlisted for roles. And I thought, actually, if I pretend to be like how I see academics looking, I might get in. And I never went to one of these interviews that I was getting shortlisted for because it just felt a bit wrong. It just felt wrong to go and profiteer off that, I guess. So I ended up doing another bit of hourly paid lecture work at another institution. They really enjoyed what I did and a role came up. You know, it was a bit of a kind of, you should apply for this. And that's how I got into
wink, wink, nudge, nudge.
Yeah.
Those are the good ones.
So I was like, okay, thank you. I guess someone else started in that role at the same time as me. So that our roles were on paper identical, but there was 2. And I joined with a white colleague. We were having a lot of fun, you know, and I remember someone who was a black academic saying to me, be careful, you might want to have a conversation with me in the future. And I was like, what's this like cloak and daggers type thing that's existed? I was like, and I didn't really get that at all, what was coming across. I started experiencing things that my white colleague who started the same time as me with the same experience, same starting point, wasn't experiencing. And at first I was like, well, what is this? Why am I experiencing something slightly different? I don't understand the differences. I was just really thinking about it over and over again. And I remember like an academic who was in my same department, like would get out of elevators when I was getting in elevators and things like that was happening. And I was thinking, what is this? Are we in higher education and there's, you know, racial microaggressions at play where like they were micro enough where it was really difficult to pinpoint them, let alone bring the pattern of evidence together to say this is what's happening.
But when you look back and you added it all together, it's plain as day. And when you go through your career, just as a person of color, you kind of see it. And I've had the same things. And so you think like with hindsight is a wonderful tool, but at the time you're still kind of convincing yourself that this is unusual, this is strange. But now you just be like, oh, I know, I can see what this is. I'm not afraid to name it now. I just say it. But back then, when you're earlier in your career, you're still in this like, and I don't know if you felt this, but you're still in this sort of like, you know, work hard, do well, and I'll get the goods kind of thing, mentality. But that's not how the world always works, especially not for people like us.
I experienced racism growing up in Wales, point blank racism, you know. This was a different racism altogether then, you know, in the workplace. And it just felt like I just couldn't get my head around it. And I spoke to that academic again who gave me that kind of warning. And it was almost like my brain's just gone to a movie scene. And I don't know if you'll get the reference, but there's a scene in Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse where the lady spins around in the chair and they're like, I've been expecting you. It was almost like that kind of moment that when I spoke to my colleague, they knew why I was going to speak to them before I even opened my mouth. And I said, this is happening. Is this normal? And they were like, welcome to HE being a black academic. And I was like, okay. And then that for the first time, the ball started rolling for me in the sense of there's a need for people who are going to work in an inclusion and equity space. Then I started to go, okay, so there's something in this that my experience growing up and the experiences that I'm having are going to mean something greater than the impact it's having on me. And I go back to that time and I still couldn't articulate what it is that I was going to do or embark on. It was still really new. And in the sense of I had a lot of learning to do, a lot of catching up to where my colleague was at and other colleagues in the space. Because I just didn't do much reading around racism and inclusion. I just was a bit naive to it, I guess. Started to realize that there was a real space to operate in. I started to realize that how I could differentiate myself from colleagues. I was looking at what my colleague was doing at the same level as me, and how could I add something to my bow that would accelerate my career? And I've seen this gap in HE where inclusion was often strategies with a lack of action and things to do. And I was thinking, right, if I can show those actions and I can deliver those actions, then I'm going to start adding additional things to my job profile and my career that other colleagues are not doing or don't see yet. So I was able to start doing these extra things and almost having this repertoire of things I could bring to the table. So when new opportunities came up, like an opportunity to move an institution to a senior lectureship role, I was able to go and sit at the table and say, right, here's all my academic things that I'm able to do. Here's all the receipts for that. But here's a bunch of other things that I do that actually relate to your inclusion strategy and your, what you want to do around equality. And then all of a sudden you're sort of sitting around the table going, okay, so this person does the things that we want, plus all these other things that we don't have in our institution. How I would describe it to someone would be, for a black academic, I think, I found a cheat code. I found a cheat code to use my lived experience, what I was good at, translating a quality strategy into action with results. This wasn't just doing it and not getting results. Reading up around the subject areas and being able to deliver, all of a sudden I found there's a huge gap. And I wasn't seeing many universities at the time, even to date, doing that to the level that needed to be done, or they were saying they were going to do it.
Let's go back a step, because we started at 18. And I always believe that there's something in people's childhood that also influences who they become in their adulthood. And so take us back to before 18 and Ibiza, and before academia, and before finding innovative ways to sort of be yourself and leverage the things that you can bring to the table and find that cheat code. Take us back to childhood, Lewis. And I want to know, what do you think helped shape your understanding around either belonging, identity, and community?
I hope you're ready for this one. I think the reason why I say that is fairly recently, I know we're going back, but I'm going to go recent first, was I spoke to a friend of mine that I met in Ibiza, even though we said we're going away from that. He is another mixed heritage guy. And we were recently talking about our experiences growing up and our childhoods. He grew up in Luton, which is massively multicultural. And I grew up in South Wales, in Cardiff and in Newport. I didn't have the same experiences that he had, or so I thought. And we were talking very quickly about being young and being sort of primary school age, developing who we are. One thing he said was around, he grew up with his mum who is white. And I grew up with my mum, who's white. But we were both mixed heritage children having this dual identity that we were trying to figure out who we were. Are we white? Are we black? Are we something in the middle? We were having this conversation about our experiences. It came to a point of how our parents dressed, or how our mums dressed us. And he mentioned something, and I've never thought about this for maybe no, well over 25 years until he said it. And I said, oh my goodness, that same thing happened to me. And he said, in the summer, why did my mum dress me in a string vest?
Oh my days. Are you kidding me?
And, and I just started laughing. And I said to him, same. I said, I don't know why. I said, why was this a thing? And his version of events was he very much was like, I don't know if my mum thought it was part of my black culture that I had to wear a string vest. And I thought, I've never asked my mum that question, and I've never thought about it in that way. It was just, these were my clothes. I wore those things. Recently, I explored my childhood and how it created who I am and who I was going to be. So yeah, going back to that early days, Lewis, we didn't have much, but my mum and dad didn't let me realize that we didn't have much. It was like really well hidden. Like I look at back now and I see things and I go, yeah, it was really well hidden how like we didn't have much. But I also remember having everything that I wanted at the same time in this really weird juxtaposition. So my mum and dad were together growing up, but my dad and mum were always in my lives, and I lived with my mum through my whole childhood. But I always see my dad at weekends, and I just thought that's how it was. I didn't know there was other types of family dynamics. All my other friends who were black had that same dynamic, so it was just how we all grew up. I experienced quite a lot of racism at the time in primary school in particular, where lots of things happened, and I don't remember the exact details. I remember more of the outcomes of those things. And my mum will probably tell stories way more articulate than me, but she said, remember me coming home from primary school once experiencing racism for the first time. And the story that I said to her was some children in the playground said that I couldn't play with them because I was black. And I didn't realize that I was black. And she said, you told them that you were Lewis. You weren't black, you were Lewis. Why can't you play? And they said, you can't play because you're black. And that was the first time that my mum, or probably me at the time, experienced like, well, actually, there's racism that's going to occur in Lewis's life. And I don't remember the conversation I had at the time with my mum. You know, I think I was in year 1 at school. Yeah, so you've been five or six. She said that she caught me at home then in the evening in the garden crying and trying to like scrub my skin to say like, why can't I be white? And that's probably like the earliest story that my mum will have of like racism that I experienced and the impact it had directly on me. And I think that kind of shaped a lot of my childhood. A lot of my childhood at school was, looking back, there was a lot of racism, ended up being like a lot of fighting at school and just kind of like trying to survive that. I moved around a lot of primary schools. We moved around a lot of houses at the time. So I didn't really have like a solid foundation to like build those relationships up. I ended up going to a primary school in year 5, end of year 5, year 6. That was the first time I could just go and be a kid at school. I went to a great primary school and I get to actually find out who I was at the time.
Part of our mutual interest is about our shared experiences. And like, I think there's something about when you grow up as someone racialized as black or brown in the UK, or you might be in a part of the country or where you are one of the only or the only, the opportunity to just be a child means very different things. And at what age do you get the privilege to do that? And so you're coming into, what age are you now? 7 or 8, or when you moved schools?
When I moved schools, I was year 5. So what's that? I think, is that 10?
10. So imagine being 10, that being the time that you get to just be a kid and play, having had those experiences before. And I think it kind of lands for me when, especially people that are parents or aunties or grandparents or whatever, what age do we start talking to children about understanding racism and deconstructing these ideals and doing that work? And if a child could experience racism at 4, 5, that's also the age that people need to be teaching it. It's not too young. And I think it's important to recognize those two different types of lived experiences that we might have.
My oldest child, Parker, is now 6. He has a white mum and me as his dad. And he presents very white compared to his younger brother, who is more my complexion. I'm very aware that at some point he's going to experience racism in some level, whether it's direct or indirect, or whether it's about his younger brother, whether it's about his dad. Someone will have a conversation around him where he will feel probably really uncomfortable. I don't want to speak for him, but something's going to happen. You know, I'm very conscious of that. And you know, he's very proud of his golden skin. You know, we've done a lot of exploration around his family history, things that I didn't do as a young person, but I want to make sure that he's aware of, so we've gone in and we've looked at where our family comes from. We come from Sierra Leone, Yemen, Barbados, and we've like really explored our family history. We've got a poster up in our house where we drew a picture of the world and all the arrows that pointed to Wales from where our family had come from, and trying to make him realize that he's the sum of all these parts that make his identity him. And no one can take that away from him. And sort of every day he goes to school, give him an affirmation about how he's special and don't let anybody take your shine. And I let him go in. And, it does strike me as that. And he said something to me actually this weekend. He said it, but then didn't want to explore it. And I am going to come back to it at some point. And he said, someone in my school said that sometimes you can't be their dad if you're not the same color as them. And I said to him, who said that to you? And he said, no, it wasn't me. No one said it to me. And I was thinking, well, it's interesting that you've said that. It's something that I want to be on top of in terms of that. I don't want him to internalize that in any way that gives him an experience where he is thinking about the color of his skin. He does ask questions about why is his younger brother more closer to dad's color than him, kind of realizing that I don't want him to experience what I experienced. And I know people might say, the world's moved on a lot from when you were a youngster, but
also has it?
Maybe someone at school might not blatantly say something. Oh, actually, they probably will. I'm not going to say that, but it might not be as punch you in the face as it was, but it's going to be nuanced and more complex now, where these intricacies are going to drip into more ways to hurt you than it maybe did in the past, particularly through technology and social media. There's more ways to get at you as an individual, whereas before it might have been a bit more obvious. So I'm very much aware of that.
Thinking about those experiences that you've had is coming through in your parenting now. You're thinking, how can I protect my child? How can I equip my child? How do I manage the world that my child is growing up in compared to the world that I grew up in, but also understanding the impact that essentially racism can have? Going back to child Lewis and those things that you experienced and moving around and becoming resilient, I guess, as a young person, and then bringing that into your today, Lewis, the culture, inclusion and leadership consultant, I guess, what would you say is something that was built in you from childhood that's carried through? Or if anything, maybe I'm reaching, I don't know.
If I was to ask that question to family, I guess they would probably say it's made me probably made me quite resilient and sometimes quite cold, in the sense of, in my childhood, I had to shut things off emotionally so they wouldn't keep impacting me in some capacity. I say that, I remember racism coming back at different points in my childhood, in more severe ways. And I didn't really start to realize what that really meant and how resilience would be until I joined a football team where everybody except for our goalkeeper was black, mixed heritage, all different religions. And for the first time I felt part of something, and I felt like, hold on a minute. So this is still in Wales as well. And I felt, oh, this is what it feels like.
What did it feel like?
I felt it in one football match. I felt it. There was a football match we played. One of our players had something racist said to him on the pitch. I was far enough away I didn't hear it, but all I remember seeing was our goalkeeper run past me, and it just erupted into a big fight. Everybody got stuck in. I remember we all come away, and our manager said to us at the time, he was like, whilst I don't want us to be fighting, he went, you all stuck together when one of you had something that happened to them. And it just resonated. And I remember him I remember looking at him when he was saying this, and I was thinking to myself, wow, for the first time, I feel like in Wales, if something gets said to me, I've got 11 people here who are all standing together. And that was 17.
17. Wow.
I just remember that feeling of okay. And just being this is it. I love this. I love this experience. It didn't land to me as impactful until we finished playing football. We were a fantastic team and we stepped together. I remember in that team, we went away to a team in the valleys in Wales, and we were a city team. So you have that city valley rivalry anyway. But we remember going away to a team, and people were throwing, grown men were throwing bananas onto the pitch at us. And, this was 2008, 2009. I was thinking, they're throwing bananas onto the pitch. Well, what is this? They were calling my mate King Kong. And I'm like, what is going on? We won 8-0. And I just remember thinking, like, we just show people like who we are and what we're about. And then it really landed to me when I finished playing in the football for a team and I met my wife. She lived in Bournemouth and I was down there all the time, and I was like, I'm going to join the football team while I'm here. And I joined the football team, and I remember being in the change rooms looking around, and I was the only one again. It took me back to being, back at primary school. And I remember thinking, like, something kicks off here. I'm on my own. I just remember thinking that in the change rooms. I don't know what brought it on, what thought brought it on, but I just remember thinking, looking around going, right, if it kicks off here, are people going to understand this? And maybe they would have, maybe they didn't. Nothing ever happened. But I just remember going, this isn't that team I was on before. Maybe that's why I never played for him again. I don't know. Those things, I think, stuck with me and probably made me a lot more resilient and cold to those things, where I could just almost switch my emotions off to some of those things. Coming to where I am now, going through higher education and then jumping into a different sector and going into sport, and realizing a lot of the issues that I was seeing in higher education, I see in sport, particularly around race and probably inclusion as a whole. There's these same conversations that are existing, and it's frustrating. And then I'm going, right, well, what do I do? It was almost like, well, this cheat code that's worked for me in higher education, I didn't realize that cheat code would eventually become the package that I have. So now, as me as Lewis Gray, the consultant, that cheat code is my package that I offer to people. It's like, actually, don't go through 5-10 years of what I had to navigate to learn all these things. Actually, I have this works. And I remember going into the sports sector and thinking, well, how do I get to prove this works, with no evidence that it works in sport, but mass amounts of evidence that it works in education?
Bring us up to the current day. You're out there, you're working in this space, you've got that multi-sector experience. What do you think is something that we are still not talking about and need to be talking more about? Or taking action, I should say.
Well, where to start, I think. And I guess for me, what I've seen, particularly over the last 6 years, has been lots of flux in this space. I'd say 6 years on purpose, because I feel like 6 years ago, there was a lot of change, a lot of talk around inclusion, how organizations and things were going to do things differently. And then we kind of fast forward 6 years, and I look at roles like EDI roles. Lots of them seem to be evolving into people and culture roles now, and falling back into HR. For me, you start putting it into HR, and then you start thinking about, what does HR functions do? And it might be a controversial take, but for me, HR functions often are there to protect the integrity of the organization rather than the people. Although people in HR might say something different to that, I guess from my experiences, that's where it is.
Depending on your organisation, because I must say, Merthyr Valleys Homes is a wonderful, wonderful people and culture team. But I do understand what you're saying, and I think it does come down to like the values and the ethics of the organisation, and whether the people behind those teams are embedded or not. And I've seen it look every which way, so I 100% understand what you're saying.
Yeah, and I guess seeing that change for me started to move to a different direction for inclusion work, where it wasn't necessarily going to be this big standalone impactful thing that it could be. It was then going to be intertwined with other areas, whether that's different strategies, when actually we hadn't got the strategies right when they were on their own standalone, to be able to then make it intertwined and make it work across organizations. From what I'm seeing, we're getting to the point where it's like the policies versus real behavior, and strategy versus lived experience. It's almost like that. What I'm seeing is that lived experience aspect is starting to get written out slightly, a little bit more for strategy policy, and that real behavior then is the missing link to that little quad puzzle, because you're not getting that real behavior change. You might have seen, I've seen some great strategies, some great policies across different organizations, and then you go, actually, okay, fast forward 4 years, you're putting out a new strategy, but it's the same as your old strategy. It's just got a different date on it. And that's what I like to do with organizations. One of my favorite things to do, maybe this is one of my cheat codes, I guess, is I love going to organizations and exploring particularly strategic equality plans, going through them. And, this is something that I would recommend people do. Have a look through historically your organization's strategic equality plan. Redact them, take all the dates, everything out, and then give them out in your organization and see if people can order them in the correct order, to see if there's been progress within that organization. From my experience, whenever I've done that across different organizations, whether working as a consultant No one's got it right yet. And it's a great way to start saying our policies and strategies are great, but the meaningful action isn't there yet. And then you can bring in the rest of the things that you can do to start bringing those vehicles to action together. There doesn't seem to be a really easy route from strategy to vehicles to action. And that's where the biggest impact is going to be. Early on in my career, I would quite quickly just jump to, here's a vehicle to action. It's not evidence-based, it's not data-led, but I know it'll work because of my lived experience. And one of the things I had to start figuring out was how that navigates and how that works in corporate settings, where
It doesn't.
Or trying your best to make it work by being like data and insight led.
100%.
And saying, here's what the data is saying, here's what the insights are saying. If we do this vehicle to action, we might move the needle. And then you start saying these little phrases like move the needle and things to then help it land a little bit better. It worked, and it does work. And then I've seen it work in HE. I've seen it work in the sports sector. I've done some work in the healthcare sector with the NHS up in Telford, produced a project called Galvanise, which looked at Black healthcare professionals, how they would better support doctors, and it worked. So this little package that I stumbled upon through my own lived experience can amplify the strategies and policies of these organizations. But it's not just my package. A lot of people that have lived experience and have that understanding of real cultural behavioral change can do that. It's just helping people realize that those people probably sit in your organization already. Those people are ready to help you do that. It's not just getting them to speak their lived experience. It's about finding the key people who align with that go, right, I need to amplify your voice. I need to amplify your message. And I need you to say, does this strategy resonate with your lived experience? If not, how?
And also what I would add to that, and I think you touched on it earlier, is it can't be embedded within a single department like HR. I think it needs to be its standalone department. And I think one of the things we've got right at Merthyr Valleys Homes is my role, which sits directly under the chief exec. And it's very specific to not be within a department. So it's not seen as a departmental responsibility. It's an organizational wide responsibility, and it feeds into every single department within the organization. And so I think if organizations are sat there thinking, yeah, we can do this, resource it. Because I still see, especially in the housing sector, so much of this is within somebody's already role. Any role that has, even though I've got an and in my role, which is fine, any role that has an and in it or commas is too big a role. It should be a single title.
Yeah.
But that's my challenge. We could keep going, and I think we could definitely do a part 2 at some point. But I feel like you've shared some really great insights, and thank you for giving us a piece of, your sort of Welsh story and sharing it. And we've spent it a lot around, obviously, the inclusion work that you do, because that's the work that you do. There's so much more to you than that. So quick fire for our listener. What brings you joy?
Probably having my downtime. My 2 kids give me the most joy. Getting to be there for them and be a present parent, I think that gives me the most joy. That is my quick fire answer to that.
And what is this song, this top 10 hit that you wanted to have? At least give us, does it have a title? Will we be seeing it on like some kind of playlist in the future? Or is it like, what genre? Give us something to like hold on to that dream of your other career. If you weren't doing the inclusion work and you were out there making music, what is it? What's the top 10 hit?
Do you know what? If I knew that, I'd have it. But I did dream it once. I dreamt it. I made the whole song in my dream. And I remember thinking, this is a dream. I need to remember this because this sounds absolutely amazing. This is the one. And then woke up and totally couldn't remember anything about it. But I remember making it in my dream. Hopefully dreams come true and it comes back at some point. But yeah, I used to find so much joy in making music, I think, before having children. That was probably my joy, was just relaxing, making music, making sounds, was just the way I just found creativity as my play.
Last one, we're more than a housing podcast. What makes a home for you?
Warmth. Warmth makes a home. And how I articulate that would be, it doesn't matter who you are, what you have. Everyone has an opportunity to feel that warmth is important to me. Whether you are home alone, whether you have a huge family, whether your family live across the world, just having that one piece of connection, that one sense of warmth makes a home a home. And when you close that door at night, that is your warmth. That is your home. Whoever you are there with, whether it's yourself or in other people, that's your family and that's your warmth.
Lewis, it's been great speaking to you. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll see you soon.
Thank you.
Our mutual interest is powered by Merthyr Valleys Homes.